The dust hung in the air like a memory that refused to settle. Elijah Carter stood in the middle of his grandfather's old mechanic shop, the place where he'd spent so many afternoons as a boy, watching grease-stained hands work miracles on engines nobody else would bother to fix. The wooden beams overhead still bore the marks of his grandfather's hammer, each dent a reminder that this shop was built with nothing but determination and calloused hands. People in town liked to say his grandfather retired peacefully, that he'd earned his rest after decades of honest work. But Elijah never forgot the way the old man's eyes clouded over when he talked about the past. There was a heaviness behind every story, a pause in his voice that hinted at something too painful to name. He could almost hear him now, the slow shuffle of boots across the concrete, the gentle clank of wrenches sliding back into place. Elijah had tried to keep the business alive, though most days he wondered if the fight was worth it. Customers had dwindled, jobs were scarce, and more than once he'd thought about locking the doors for good. But something held him here, something deeper than obligation. Maybe it was the feeling that his grandfather's story hadn't really ended. That morning, Elijah decided to clean out the back office, a small square room with a single dusty window. It had always been locked, as if the old man wanted to keep a part of himself hidden. When Elijah finally turned the key, the door creaked open to reveal boxes stacked to the ceiling and a faint smell of motor oil and mildew. He started sorting through them one by one. Old invoices, faded photographs, brittle newspaper clippings. Nothing unusual until he reached a battered metal cabinet, tucked behind a stack of tires. He almost missed it. The cabinet door was stiff with rust, and when he finally pried it open, he found a thick leather-bound journal resting on the bottom shelf. The cover was cracked and stained, the edges worn soft by decades of handling. He lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palms. He set it on the workbench and flipped it open. The first page held his grandfather's name, written in bold, looping letters. Below that, a single sentence in small, careful script. If you're reading this, then you deserve to know the truth. Elijah's chest tightened. He turned the next page and started reading. The entries were dated in the late 1970s. They described work orders that were mysteriously canceled, clients who stopped answering calls, equipment that disappeared overnight. And always the same name, woven through every account: Mercer. The Mercer family had owned the biggest dealership in the county for generations. They still did. He'd grown up seeing their billboards along the highway, the smiling faces promising fair deals and family values. He'd never once imagined they'd had anything to do with his grandfather's sorrow. As he read, a dull heat rose in his throat. There were entries about threats scribbled on the shop windows, late-night calls warning him to close up or face the consequences. One line stopped Elijah cold. They came in the night and slashed the tires on every car in the yard. Left a note that said a black man had no business owning this place. Elijah's hand trembled. He pressed his thumb to the words as if he could somehow reach back and comfort the man who wrote them. All his life, he'd believed his grandfather simply grew tired. That age had slowed him down. That time had gently pushed him into retirement. But here was proof it hadn't been gentle at all. Here was the truth no one had ever spoken out loud. And in that moment, standing in the same shop where his grandfather had built a future out of nothing, Elijah felt the first sharp edge of anger. He knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. I'm David. And this is Injustice Voice. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, subscribe to this channel and join me. Your comments matter. Your voice matters. Let's uncover what was buried and make sure it never gets hidden again. The more Elijah read, the more the walls seemed to press in around him. Every page of that journal was a confession, a wound split open so the truth could finally bleed out. His grandfather had written it all down, as if he knew no one would ever believe him without evidence. The words were steady, precise, stripped of any self-pity. Just facts. There were nights when a cross burned in the gravel lot behind the shop. The flames lit up the sky while his grandfather sat inside, clutching a rifle he never wanted to use. Customers who once shook his hand stopped coming without a word. A deal for a fleet repair contract vanished after he refused to sell out to the Mercers. He never told Elijah's father what really happened. Maybe he thought silence would keep them safe. Elijah felt grief thick as tar in his chest. How many times had he heard the neighbors call his grandfather stubborn, say he just didn't know how to run a business in a modern world? All the while, the Mercer family had been pulling strings behind the scenes, choking off every chance he had to succeed. The Mercers were still here, still wealthy, still praised in the local paper for their generous contributions to the community. It made Elijah sick. The same family who left a man terrified in his own shop was the one folks lined up to thank every Christmas. He closed the journal and sat in the quiet, staring at the cracked concrete floor. There were moments when he wanted to believe it couldn't be true, that maybe his grandfather had imagined the threats, exaggerated the danger. But he knew the man who wrote these pages. He knew the way he carried himself with quiet dignity that no one could shake. If he'd written it down, it happened. Elijah couldn't sit there any longer. He needed answers. He needed to look someone in the eye and ask why nobody did a damn thing. So he drove across town to a little white house with blue shutters. Mr. Tucker had been his grandfather's friend for 40 years. He was the one who taught Elijah how to change a carburetor. He was the one who brought casseroles after his grandfather passed. Mr. Tucker answered the door in his work clothes, eyes soft with the memory of the boy Elijah used to be. But when Elijah held up the journal, the old man's face went pale. "Can I come in?" Elijah asked. Mr. Tucker stepped aside without a word. They sat in the kitchen, the journal between them like a live wire. Elijah flipped to a page near the middle, where his grandfather described the night the shop was vandalized for the 3rd time. How he'd called Mr. Tucker in desperation. "You were there," Elijah said quietly. Mr. Tucker rubbed a trembling hand over his mouth. "I was. Why didn't you ever tell me?" His voice cracked, and it shamed him, but he didn't care. "I was young," Mr. Tucker whispered. "I was scared. You have to understand. Back then, folks like the Mercers could ruin a man without even lifting a finger. They had the sheriff in their pocket. The bank too. I had kids. If I'd spoken up, I could have lost everything." Elijah pressed his palms against the edge of the table, willing himself not to explode. "So you watched them break him, and you said nothing?" Mr. Tucker looked up, eyes glistening. "I'm sorry. I wish I'd had more courage." The apology hung between them, heavy and useless. It wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't erase the nights his grandfather sat alone, waiting for someone to torch the place. Elijah swallowed hard. "They still own this town, don't they?" "All this time, nothing's really changed." Mr. Tucker dropped his gaze to the floor. "No, not much." That was the moment Elijah understood the truth that had been sitting just out of reach's hole. Life. The Mercer family didn't just steal money. They stole dignity. They made sure any black man who dared to build something would remember exactly who held the power. He stood up and slipped the journal back into his bag. For a second, he thought he might say something kind to the man who'd taught him so much as a boy. But he couldn't. Not now. Outside, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the street. Elijah felt them stretching toward him, reminding him that the Mercer family's reach was still here, still wrapping itself around every corner of this town. But he also felt something else. The anger was still there, sharper now, cleaner. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of it. Elijah lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling. He thought about every reason to let it go, every voice in his head warning him he was only going to stir up old trouble. But the thought of that journal collecting dust again made him feel sick. He knew the truth would eat him alive if he didn't set it free. When morning came, he made a list. Names of people who'd known his grandfather, people who'd whispered for years about the Mercers, but never dared say it out loud. He called the church secretary and asked if he could reserve the hall for a community meeting. She sounded nervous, but agreed. Word traveled fast in a small town. By the end of the day, a few folks had already called him to ask what he was planning. He just told them he had something they needed to hear. On Saturday evening, the old church hall filled with the creak of folding chairs and low murmurs. The walls were lined with yellowed portraits of preachers long gone. Elijah stood at the front, gripping the journal so tight his knuckles ached. He'd never spoken in front of so many people before. The faces staring back were wary, some curious, some already looking like they wished they'd stayed home. He cleared his throat and began. He told them about the threats, the sabotage, the cross burnings. He read the words his grandfather had written, voice steady even when his hands shook. For a long time, no one said a word. He could feel the fear in the room, like a cold draft. Slipping under the door, then an older woman in the second row lifted her chin. Her hair was silver, her back straight as a fence post. "My father had a farm up near the ridge," she said. "Mercer's bought the banknote when he fell behind one season. They doubled the interest overnight. He worked himself into an early grave trying to keep it. They took everything." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. The silence cracked open. A man at the back spoke up. "My uncle ran a hauling business. Same story. They'd send boys to slash his tires, break his windows. Sheriff never came." Someone else raised a hand. "They threatened my mother when she tried to start a cafe downtown. Said nobody would come if she didn't pay them a security fee." One by one, the stories came. Each confession was like a match striking in the dark. Elijah felt something fierce rising in him. It was more than anger now, it was the knowledge he wasn't alone. His grandfather hadn't been alone either. When the last voice faded, he stepped forward and held up the journal. "This doesn't have to stay hidden anymore," he said. "I'm going to share it. Every page. I know it's dangerous, but I can't let them keep owning our silence." There were nods. A few murmured amens. Someone clapped, and it spread until the whole room was applauding. After the meeting, a woman with a press badge approached him. She introduced herself as Carla from the county newspaper. "If you want to publish excerpts," she said, "I'll help you. You have my word." He nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. By the time he drove home, the sky was black, the road empty. For the first time in days, he let himself imagine what might happen if people really listened. Maybe it would finally change something. Maybe this town could find its conscience again. But that night, the first threat arrived. He found the note taped to his front door. The handwriting was blocky, rushed. "You don't know what you're starting. Shut up and walk away while you can." He read it twice, then crumpled it in his fist. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he didn't feel scared in the way he expected. He felt clear. He called Carla the next morning and told her to run the story. He called the church to schedule another meeting. He called Mr. Tucker, even though he wasn't sure the old man deserved to know, and said he was going to bring the truth into daylight, whether anyone liked it or not. With every phone call, he felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. The same weight that had crushed his grandfather. But this time, it was going to be different. He stood alone in the shop that evening, the journal resting on the workbench like a promise. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice, low and steady, telling him to keep going. And Elijah knew. No matter how many threats came, he wasn't going to be silenced. The gravel crunched under Elijah's boots as he stepped out of his truck and looked at the wreckage. Every window in the shop had been smashed, shards glittering in the headlights like broken ice. The words scrawled across the walls were too filthy to repeat, big black letters dripping fresh paint. He stood there a long moment, feeling the cold seep through his jacket and into his bones. He took out his phone and called the sheriff's office. When the deputy finally showed up, he walked around the building with a flashlight, frowning like this was all just some harmless prank. "Looks like kids," the deputy said. "Probably just trying to scare you." "Kids?" Elijah felt his voice sharpen. "Kids don't write that. Kids don't know how to hate like that." The deputy shrugged. "Not much we can do. You don't have cameras, no witnesses." He wrote something in a small notebook and got back in his cruiser without another word. Elijah watched the tail lights fade down the road, his fists clenched so tight he thought the bones might crack. Inside, the air was sharp with paint fumes and the smell of glass dust. He walked from window to window, pressing his palm against the cold metal frames. This place had already survived so much. He couldn't let them take it now. The next morning, Elijah was sweeping up broken glass when a black sedan rolled to a stop in front of the shop. A man in a gray suit stepped out, smooth as polished marble. He introduced himself as Mr. Daniels, legal representative for the Mercer family. "Mr. Carter," the man began, voice syrupy with false politeness. "My clients are concerned these allegations could be damaging to their reputation." Elijah didn't say a word. He just kept sweeping, the bristles scraping across the floor. The lawyer reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. "My clients are prepared to offer you a settlement in exchange for the journal and your agreement not to pursue this matter any further." Elijah looked up, meeting his eyes. "You mean hush money?" The man didn't flinch. "You've suffered vandalism, threats. This could all go away. Think of your safety, your business, your family." Elijah's hands were trembling now, but not from fear. From the pure, white-hot rage rising in his chest, he tossed the broom aside and walked up until they were nearly nose to nose. "You tell them I'm not for sale." Mr. Daniels adjusted his tie, a small flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "I'd advise you to reconsider." "Get off my property," Elijah said, voice low. The lawyer left without another word. By noon, the whole town had heard about it. Some folks stopped by to shake his hand, offer a hug, slip an envelope of cash to help with repairs. But just as many crossed the street to avoid looking him in the eye. At the diner, he heard his name whispered, laced with disgust. Trouble, stirring up the past. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with the journal laid open in front of him. He thought about his grandfather, about every night the old man had spent alone in this same battle. Elijah understood now just how heavy that burden had been. But he also knew he couldn't drop it. Not after coming this far. He picked up the phone and called Carla. "I want to organize a protest," he said. "Peaceful. At the courthouse." "You're sure?" she asked. "Unsure." 2 days later, he stood on the courthouse steps, a microphone trembling in his hand. A crowd had gathered, neighbors, reporters, strangers who'd read about it in the paper. Cameras blinked in the afternoon sun. He took a breath and spoke into the mic. "This isn't just about my grandfather. It's about every person who's been told to sit down and shut up. About every family who lost what they built because somebody else decided they didn't deserve it." He held up the journal so everyone could see. "This is the truth, and it's not going away." Somewhere in the crowd, someone started clapping. Others joined in. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough. When he stepped down, a reporter shoved a microphone toward him. "Mr. Carter, the Mercers have just released a statement denying everything. They say you're trying to smear their good name." Elijah looked straight into the camera lens. "They can deny it all they want. The facts are in black and white." That night, as he locked up the shop, another note was waiting under the door, but he didn't read it. He crumpled it in his fist and threw it in the trash. Whatever it said didn't matter. He had already decided. He wasn't going to be silent. Not now, not ever again. The weeks that followed felt like living inside a storm that wouldn't let up. Some days, Elijah walked into the shop and found it empty, the phone silent, the calendar blank. Longtime customers he'd known since he was a boy stopped calling. A few wouldn't even look him in the eye when they passed him on the street. Money got tight. He watched the ledger shrink and felt the same worry he'd seen in his grandfather's eyes all those years ago. The fear of losing everything. But even in the quiet, he never felt regret. Not once, because for every door that closed, another. One cracked open. People started showing up he'd never met before, folks from the next county. Young men and women who'd read the newspaper articles or seen the protest on TV. They shook his hand, thanked him for speaking up. Some of them carried stories of their own. Stories of stolen farms, shuttered shops, families run out of town in the dark. Every time someone told him, Elijah wrote it down. He kept a new journal, its pages clean and waiting. He wasn't going to let any more truth die in the shadows. Then came the call that changed everything. A woman's voice, quiet and shaking, told him she was Anna Mercer, granddaughter of the man who had tried to destroy Elijah's grandfather. She said she'd spent her life hearing only the Mercer version, how they were the good guys, the builders, the ones who deserved it all. But after reading the stories and seeing the protests, she started digging through her family's records. I found documents, she whispered. Bank letters, ledgers, they prove what he wrote in the journal. I can't keep them hidden anymore. When the records were published, even the most loyal defenders of the Mercer name fell silent. The proof was there, in cold ink and official stamps. The sabotage had been real. The intimidation had been deliberate. No amount of denial could bury it again. There were still people who called him a liar, who swore he'd ruined the town's good name for attention. But the truth was out. And once it was out, it belonged to everyone. Some nights, he sat alone in the office and wondered if he'd made the right choice. The shop was barely scraping by. He didn't know if he could hold on through another slow season. But then he'd walk to the doorway and look out across the lot. The same place his grandfather once stood with a rifle across his knees, determined to keep what he'd built. Elijah felt a quiet pride rise in his chest. He knew this was the cost of telling the truth, the cost of refusing to look away, and he could live with it. He'd broken the silence that strangled his community for generations. And if he listened close, he could almost hear his grandfather's voice on the wind, steady, unbroken, proud. I'm David, and this is Injustice Voice. If this story moved you, if you believe in standing up no matter the cost, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment. Let your voice be part of the truth that will never be buried again.